We're with Dwayne Beck here from the Dakota Lakes Research Station, and it's been great meeting with you. Very, very different conditions today compared to yesterday. You were out harvesting till I don't know what time, but I've got some good footage of you harvesting
in the dark.
Yeah. Well, Dwayne, before we start talking about some of your takes on the science of soil health, I'm really interested to know the story of Dakota Lakes Research Farm first, and then I want to sort of segue that into your story. But tell us the story of Dakota Lakes Research Farm. It really looks very, very unique. So,
well, the Dakota Lakes Research Farm is owned by a not-for-profit or 501c3 corporation that was put together by area farmers, and these guys at the time it started were actually irrigators. And it was in the early 1980s that the concept actually developed, and it had to do with the fact that they had built a bunch in the late 70s, this big God's not making any more soil rah times, which are maybe not dissimilar from now, and they'd put in a bunch of irrigation development along the Missouri River on less soils, and less soils tend to seal up when you hit them with rain. If they're bare, they tend to seal up in water runs, and they'd put these irrigators up on top of the hills and pump water on them, and the water ran back to the river, and that wasn't working very well. And then the Arab oil embargo type thing worked its way into the system, and the energy costs went way up, and so now they wanted to go to low pressure irrigation instead of high pressure. So now instead of putting an inch of water on in 30 or 40 minutes, they're going to put an inch of water on in 6 minutes. And obviously they're already having runoff issues, and so that's kind of when I had entered the picture, doing some research on irrigation as a graduate student, and noticed the runoff and started trying to address those issues for them. And we had, along with Daryl DeBoer, we had some stuff going on how to stop runoff under these sprinklers. And after a field day one night, some farmers said, well, we need to have more of this type of research. And I said, well, you're not going to do that unless you have a site someplace out here, because you can't come from the university this far and try to do research. It's not efficient. And it's not going to be comprehensive. It's not going to be what you need. And they said, well, we'll just go to the legislature and get you some land. And I just said, if you do that, you'll lose control of it immediately. I love the university and it's great and whatever, but it doesn't think like a farmer. And so you can have all the advisory committees you want, but unless they have a dog in the fight or skin in the game, whatever you want to call it, unless they're intimately involved in the thing, they don't get listened to. So it took them a long time, because this was in the 1980s when nobody wanted to talk agriculture. And it took them a long time to raise the money to get the place put together, but we bought this piece of property and started operations in 1990. So we've been here over 20 years, and it's always been no-till. But the interesting thing was, when we started, no-till was not part of what we were doing. In terms of the 1980s, I mean, no-till was part of what I was doing, but it wasn't anything the farmers were doing. It wasn't the reason for having Dakota Lakes. The reason for having Dakota Lakes had to do with more efficient irrigation. If you look at our mission and goals, it says nothing about no-till. It says environmentally friendly and efficient and whatever, which you aren't that unless you're doing no-till. But no-till alone, without all the other things we do, doesn't really make any sense either. And a lot of the ways guys are doing quote-unquote no-till in the U.S. doesn't make much sense, because there's no diversity and there's no attention to water cycles and nutrient cycles and sunlight and whatever. They're just not doing tillage, but it's basically a conventional system with the tillage taken out.
Okay.
So
it sounds then like your story is very intimately connected with the Dakota Lake story. A lot of what you've learned here, you started off looking really at irrigation, but what I hear you always talk about is looking at natural cycle. What does Mother Nature do?
right.
So is that more or less correct? I mean, is your story tied very much to the development and the thought process at Dakota Lakes?
Yeah, and it's been a building process. Like we were looking to how do you more efficiently use water?
Okay.
And how do you make water go in the soil and those type of things. And when we started, if you read the literature, everybody knew that no-till had more runoff than conventional tillage.
Okay.
If you read the literature.
At that time.
At that time.
Yes.
And it had to do with the way they were doing, what they defined no-till as, and how they were doing the studies and whatever. But no-till at that time was they'd take a conventionally tilled field. After harvest, they'd till some of it, leave some of it untilled, and sprinkle it with water, and water ran off more in the no-till, see?
Right.
And so we actually included a no-till type treatment in some of what we're doing as kind of a high runoff check. But after 3 years, it wasn't the high runoff check anymore.
Okay.
But then to try to get people to move that way in the system took a while.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to get Dr. Chu who was a very well-respected soil physicist or ag engineer type guy.
Yes.
And we got him out and did some infiltration work on some of our land that we'd no-tilled for a while, and all of a sudden he's going, wow.
Okay.
And then kind of that started to change the mindset. And then, the evolution of what we were doing, because in the period between 1983 and 1990, I managed a research center at Redfield, South Dakota then.
Okay.
Because Dakota Lakes wasn't there yet, and I was done with my PhD, so they hired me to run, university had hired me to run this station at Redfield. And I recognize that it's important to make water go in under irrigation. It's more important to make water go in well on dry land, because under irrigation, if I run some water back to the river, I can pump more if I have enough time and enough money.
Yes.
In dry land, if I run water back to the river, I can't pump more.
Right.
And so we kind of figured out that maybe we should be looking at the dry land aspects pretty hard as well. And in reality, what Dakota Lakes Research Farm was originally called Dakota Lakes Irrigation Research Farm.
Got it.
And before we came here, we changed the corporate name to just Dakota Lakes Research Farm, because we started putting the emphasis on both dry land and irrigation. And most of the guys who were irrigators who started Dakota Lakes no longer irrigate. Because it's too costly.
Yes.
And especially with the high lifts.
Yeah.
And even with all the efficiencies that we throw into the system with our low pressure and all this stuff we're doing, and we're about as efficient as you can get. We probably use 2/3 of water that you'd use if you're doing tillage. But even at that, you make more money per dollar invested.
Right.
On dry land as compared to irrigation.
Okay.
And we irrigate, we call it 2/4 of land, but we irrigate about 35% of the property we have here.
Yes.
And to us, it's a great tool, and the biology moves faster on the irrigation, being more like the Corn Belt. It's kind of our simulation of the Corn Belt.
Okay, so it behaves pretty similarly to a Corn Belt.
Yeah, it'd be like if we always talk about native vegetation, if I just ran my irrigators and didn't put anything there, it'd be a tall grass prairie is what it would be. And because of we just added a bunch of rainfall to what would be a tall grass prairie ecosystem. and so that would develop there. And the other thing it does is the biology goes faster, so we can develop soil properties, these really wonderful soil properties, so much faster in high rainfall than we can in low rainfall. I mean, it just takes a lot longer to heal the damage in the low rainfall areas. And our low rainfall stuff is, probably we've been there 20 years or a little over 20 years, and it's probably we probably developed the same kind of structure in about 5 or 7 with the irrigation, simply because you have so much more biomass and potential for doing things.
Okay. Just give us a little bit of an idea of the conditions that your farm is, that Dakota Lakes Research Farm is. You have 2 basic soil types, and your climate is somewhat challenging, shall we say?
Well, we're in kind of a mixed grass prairie area, I'd say, and that's hard to tell, actually. I mean, what we have here now is mixed grass prairie. Now, we've been growing tall grass prairie here on some pretty marginal soils, and if you read the diaries of Lewis and Clark, who walked right along the south side of our property in 1804. They didn't stop in 1806. Okay. We're going home.
Okay.
But 1804, when they're coming upriver, they basically, Lewis walked along, as near as I can tell by reading the original journals, right across the south side of our property.
Yeah.
And he was finding tall grass prairie stuff.
Yeah. So that's
the big stuff we've got down there,
right.
and switchgrass and big blue stem, and it's because it was developed with this massive herds of bison coming through and eating it once a year maybe.
Yeah.
And then you had the elk and the browsers and those kind of guys, the pronghorns and those guys there. But that massive impact of the bison herds. But they weren't grazing like we graze now. And so what's happened is we've grazed and may probably degraded the soils from what they were when Lewis and Clark came through.
Yeah. So
before.
With them it might be more akin to mob grazing, and now it's very much
yeah, it would be a mob grazing type thing, and it has to, and some of those ideas are now coming back. So I don't know what it's going to look like. But we've had a tremendous success with what we've done with Harvard Bow and the tall grass prairie stuff.
Yeah,
and you saw some of it yesterday.
I did.
It's massive, and
it's like dancing with wolves.
Well, and the soils there, where you were yesterday, are these very shallow ocean bottom soils. They're really considered marginal, even for grazing.
And they've got 80% clay?
Yes.
Wow, that's phenomenal. And you said something like 4 inches of water in the profile?
Yeah, and probably where you were, it wouldn't hold quite 4.
Okay.
Of available water.
Okay,
I mean,
available
hold
water.
more water, but not available.
Right.
But again, that comes down to the question of what's available. See, our measurement of what's available may not be what's really available if you have a massive root system like the tall grass prairie plants. They might be much better at extracting water than what we can with a pressure plate.
You're right, okay.
So you got to be careful with, but according to the book,
yes,
they're because they're really shallow. Where you were, that soil is probably only 2 to 2.5 foot deep over shale. Yeah.
And that's the pure shale. That's
pure shale, fractured shale stuff. And,
right.
That's called an opal.
Okay.
That's an opal soil, and then the next one, shallower, would be a sandsark, which.
Okay. Yeah.
And the deeper one is a promise up there, but when I was young, I would read journals of explorers and early homesteaders, and those are fascinating to me. And of course, the Little House on the Prairie books were South Dakota origin, and you read about these people coming, and the grass is as high as the back of a horse, and my only thoughts at that time was they had little tiny horses.
Shetland ponies.
Yeah, I mean, just really little tiny horses, because the stuff that was there now was this little stuff.
Right,
but
right.
those are invasive species that are the cool season species. And I think what really happened is, you know, the European, the different ecosystem, and they came here and they were used to being able to turn their livestock out early in the spring and just let them graze all summer, and they would eat, you know, because it rained all summer, and they'd eat those grasses, and everybody is happy. But if you do that here, you just totally shift the ecosystem to these real crappy grasses that and the nice tall grass prairie guys go away. So you know, one of the most surprising things to me has been how well those tall grass prairie species have done on really marginal soil.
Yeah. So that's what they're designed for. So.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your philosophy of science, Dwayne. In terms of, I think you talked a little bit about, you know, something reminded me of sort of, we often as scientists want to kind of pass one thing out and just look at that one thing and almost put it in a lab kind of setting. But really, I think from what I understand, you use a systems approach. Why would that be? Or tell us about how you approach the science of soils and soil health and growing things over here.
Well, there's several things involved. I think that, you know, I grew up on a farm with watching my grandfather and father, and actually a lot of the technique we use goes back to some of those techniques that they use that probably had gone down through centuries of development. Some of the concepts, and I'm not sure they knew exactly why they were doing some things, but that's one input. The other part of I think my experience that is important is my undergraduate training is as a chemist and a physicist. Well, most people don't know that.
I saw that. Well, you know, my background is in chemical engineering.
Okay.
So I used to love the stoichiometry because it was so tidy. So this sort of hearing about soil health and everything that goes on in that really blew my mind and changed my mindset.
Well, but yeah, see, my daughters are becoming engineers, and the training of an engineer is a little bit different than a chemist. I mean, one of the things I taught chemistry for a while. One of the things that I always thought was fascinating in both chemistry and physics was to go back to how the historical discoveries were made. How they discovered that, you know, Rutherford shooting things at this foil and thinking that it's uniform, and then some of them went through and some of them bounced this way and some of them come bouncing back. And which the only thing that could describe that is having little tiny areas of high density surrounded by areas with, not high density. So, you know, looking at that whole system, and then the other thing, especially in physics, is you know, trying to use fundamental principles to describe how things work. And in a systems approach, what we're doing is we're using basic ecology principles to try to decide how things work. And you look at the top of the food chain, and you know, and how does what that tell you about everybody that's underneath, that whole web that's underneath? You look at the species that's the top of the food chain, and you know, that's because there's so little we know about biology. We think we know a lot about biology, but it's so little we know about biology that one of the things you have to do, and that's what we started with in no-till, is one of the things you have to do is look at a model, something that's the same way. And so we use native vegetation. Like when I took over the farm at Redfield, the first farm that I managed before Dakota Lakes became Dakota Lakes. When when I took over that farm was actually when funding for ag research started to decline in 1983. And if you follow the history of when the land grant university system funding started to fall apart, was in that exactly that period of time.
Great timing for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. and my boss, who's at that time was a guy by the name of Ray Moore, who was a great guy, and he told me a couple things that he really wanted me to work on organic, and because that was hot at that period of time, and organic / sustainable. And I said, well, I agree with the sustainable part. I just don't think organic is, because of the tillage.
Right.
And I said, and I think what we're doing is going to be the real answer. And he said, fine, you can work on that. You know, instead of saying, no, I'm the boss, you're going to work on organic, he said, you can work on that as long as it shows promise.
Yeah.
You know, he gave me that leverage. And the other thing he said is, he said, the funding you have today would be the most you'll ever have. It's going to become less and less and less as you go forward, which it has.
Yeah.
And I said, can I keep at that time, the money from the production side of the operation was sold and went back to state government.
Okay.
And I said, can I keep the production funds?
Yes.
And he said, we'll see if they'll buy into that, which they did, because it was $15,000 a year or something.
Right.
And they go, fine, let him keep that, right? And so we then started to focus even there very hard on, we're going to have a system that's environmentally friendly, but it's also going to make money, because we need to make money to do. And that's why we run this operation, and that pervades what we find.
So you're not only you're doing research with a farmer's mindset.
Yes.
Okay, so you're under real constraints of weather and soils and everything else, but also economic constraints.
Yeah, and I'll use a southern, since you're from South Carolina, I'll use a southern saying, that's a pretty dog but does a SOB hunt.
So that's a pretty dog, but it won't hunt. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it does the SOB hunt, and if you take a look at a lot of what's done in terms of research,
yeah,
it's, boy, this is the greatest thing, and part of it's PR, but this is the greatest. This is a wonderful crop. Yeah. This is a wonderful thing. Boy, this is just the greatest thing. But boy, this is 5 years later, it's nowhere to be found because the thing doesn't hunt. So we have a nice combination here of we do have, at Dakota Lakes, we have researchers from South Dakota State University come here.
And they're the guys who do the
They do the little small plot trials, and you could see them out there when you were out there last night.
Yep, yep.
And in the past, probably not so much now as in the past, because we just don't have as many of them as we used to. But in the past, you could say, here's a problem we have. Could you give us some help with this in terms of, let's do a little research or whatever. Now we have to do more of that ourselves, but because they're just getting thinned out, and the guys that are left have to do this real short-term grant research stuff that may not fit what we need to have done, which is unfortunate, but hopefully that will change. But we can look at what the small plot guy is doing.
Yes.
And find something in there that we think fits part of what we need, and then we scale it up.
Okay.
And that's always, in my opinion, been the thing missing.
And that's where you see if the dog hunts.
You see if the dog hunts.
Okay,
you take it to the field and you see if it hunts, and where are you going to hunt it? I mean, not all dogs hunt same kind of cover, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
Maybe there's a fit here for it, but not someplace else. So we've brought in a lot of alternative crops, and we've done a lot of work with engineering things in terms of ag engineering, equipment design, because if it doesn't fit Des Moines, Iowa, it's not really important to John Deere or Case or whatever. I mean, they're pretty focused on those major production areas, that's where the market is.
Yeah. Well, I saw one of your articles, and we'll talk about that later, no-tilling in the mud. So
Yeah.
and that I was kind of surprised at some of the things you were doing there. Well, you started out in the no-till area. I also see that you have a fairly unique approach to cover cropping as well. Especially, I think you really want to be very deliberate about, well, number one, diversity, crop diversity, and then cover cropping. Would you kind of speak to that in both those things?
The thing is, no-till is a tool. I mean,
right.
And I don't want to get hung up on this, but yeah, I do. I mean, the goal is, the overall goal is to mimic natural ecosystems.
Okay.
As closely as we can,
Right.
in terms of how we cycle the nutrients, how we harvest the sunlight, how we cycle the water, and that's totally, if we do that, then we're probably going to do very little harm. If we come in and just say, well, this is what I want to do, and how can I change the ecosystem to make it do what I want it to do? Most likely we're going to have all these unintended repercussions that we have no idea what they are.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when I look at no-till, it's a tool that I have to use in order to not screw up the ecosystem, because I need to make water go in the ground, and I need to, if I do tillage, water doesn't go in the ground. I mean, and we figured that out with the irrigation, but I mean, that was just kind of okay. But if I make water go in the ground, but I'm not doing other things right, my yields aren't going to be there. So now, as part of that system,
Yes.
now that I got the water going in the ground, that's good. But how do I keep from having all the diseases and insects and all the things that everybody says is associated with no-till? And if you went back 25 years when we started that, and that comes down to the things I learned from my grandfather and my dad, who farmed when they didn't have all the
big implements.
pesticides and those kind of things.
Right.
How do you handle some of these things? And they did it with crop rotations. And then one of the things they did, because they did do tillage, albeit not like we do now, because
They didn't have the big machines and things.
yeah,
like
I did a lot of tillage with a WD-45 Alice Chalmers or a U Minneapolis Moline open station, and away you go, right? You're not going to do tillage like you can do it now. But how did they heal the soil after they tilled it for a number of years and the weeds would build up? Well, they put it back into perennials. But the other thing that did is it put a deep root down. It cycled the nutrients back to the surface. So
that's the perennial.
yeah,
Okay.
because it put the deep root system down, and then it caught the lime and stuff that was starting to go down and making the pH go down. They'd bring it back to the surface. I mean, there's all these things that they did that made a lot of sense, but they didn't know exactly why they're doing it. But they were, every so often you got to put in a perennial.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for doing that was to build the fertility by having legumes in that mix or whatever. And so, the overall goal is to match the ecosystem. You can't do that if you do tillage.
Right.
You can't do that if you're using fire. You can't, these things. And then when you go beyond that, cover crops then become a tool, just like no-till,
Right.
that help you better match. There's little periods in there when you can't quite do it with a crop to produce grain, because a crop to produce grain takes a certain amount of time and a certain amount of moisture, and you got periods in there when you need to do something, but you don't have time to do a full crop. And to me, a forage crop is what cover crops are really a forage crop.
Right.
I mean, if you read a lot of my old stuff, I talked about forage crops as doing that. Well, that's a cover crop. You're just not having anything eat it. if you just leave it. But I think that eventually we're going to see that as a mistake. We've got to get the cattle and stuff back in the system to mimic what the bison were doing.
Right.
But you know, we do have little tiny guys eating it. You know, we have these little tiny microorganisms eating away at our cover crops. So I mean, we are cycling it, but it's not the mega herbivores that we
had in the past.
In the past. Yeah. But I mean, the idea is how close can we get to mimicking the natural ecosystem? And you know, one we're doing right now that, you know, yesterday I didn't have time. Maybe today we'll have time to go look at it if it quits raining. But we have alfalfa and corn growing in the same field at the same time.